town of Chapel Hill, North Carolina, is one of those places where life seems to move at a gentle, unhurried pace. Tree-lined streets frame historic brick buildings, and the campus of the University of North Carolina stretches across the heart of it all. A blend of tradition and youth, history and ambition. On most nights, the air is filled with the faint murmur of students walking back from late study sessions, the clinking of glasses from bars on Franklin Street, and the sound of cicadas singing in the warm southern dark. On the evening of Wednesday, September 12th, 2012, Chapel Hill looked exactly as it always had. Students hurried to finish homework, professors graded papers. In downtown, the lights of bars and clubs glowed against the late summer night. But for 19-year-old Faith Hedgepeth, it was a night meant for a break from the grind. A night to go out, unwind, and dance away the stress of college life. Faith wasn't just another student blending into the flow of campus life. She had grown up in Warrenton, North Carolina, a small, close-knit community where her kindness and determination had already made her stand out. A proud member of the Hallowasaponi Native American tribe, she carried her heritage with grace. She was driven by a simple but powerful goal: to become a pediatrician. Her friends said she had a natural instinct to help people and a smile that could disarm even the most guarded stranger. She had earned her spot at UNC through hard work and perseverance. Faith was balancing her studies, a part-time job, and an active social life. She was close to her family, especially her mother, Connie, who she often called for advice or just to talk about her day. Faith lived off campus at the Hawthorne at the View Apartments with her friend Karina Rosario. Their relationship was complicated at times. Friends knew they had ups and downs, moments of closeness and moments of tension. But on that night, the plan was simple. The two young women were going out. Earlier in the evening, Faith and Karina spent time at a friend's apartment before deciding to head to The Thrill, a popular club in downtown Chapel Hill. For many students, The Thrill was the place to dance, to meet people, and to forget about exams for a while. Surveillance footage would later capture them arriving just after midnight. Faith wore a white tank top and jeans, her long hair falling in loose waves over her shoulders. Karina, dressed in dark colors, walked beside her. They looked like two ordinary friends out to enjoy themselves. Inside, the music was loud, bass vibrating through the floor. Colored lights swept across the crowd, catching flashes of faces in the haze. Faith danced, laughed, and occasionally checked her phone. Around 2:06 a.m., they were seen leaving. Outside, the air was still warm, the kind of humid southern night that clings to your skin. The streets downtown were alive with students spilling out of bars, cars idling as they waited for friends, and the occasional shout from across the street. Faith and Karina stopped briefly at a late-night restaurant before heading back to the apartment complex. It was the kind of night where nothing seemed unusual. No shadows lingering in the parking lot. No footsteps following too closely. Back at the apartment, something shifted. At some point after they returned, Karina left again with another friend. Later, she would tell police that she and Faith had argued, and she wanted to give things some space. She said Faith was alive, in bed, when she walked out the door. It was now the early hours of September 13th, and the apartment at Hawthorne at the View stood quiet. Whatever happened next, the approach, the entry, the attack, happened in those hours when most of the world was sleeping. By morning, sunlight spilled across the parking lot. Karina returned just before 11 a.m., accompanied by a male friend. The moment she stepped inside, she felt something was wrong. The apartment was silent, too still. Faith's bedroom door was slightly ajar. Karina pushed it open and froze. Faith's half-naked body lay on the floor, her head and hair matted with blood. The walls, the bedding, even parts of the floor bore the spatter of the violence that had been unleashed on her. Her body was partially covered by a comforter, as if someone had tried, or pretended, to hide her. Beside her, investigators would later find a fast food paper bag, torn and stained, with a message scrawled in blocky, uneven capital letters. "I'm not stupid, be jealous." The air in the room was thick with the metallic tang of blood. Karina didn't scream. Instead, she turned and called 911. The call would become infamous. The woman's tone was oddly calm, her words precise. She told the operator that her friend was unconscious and, "There's blood everywhere." The operator asked if she was breathing. "No," came the quick reply, almost certain. From the start, she spoke about Faith in the past tense, something that would later disturb investigators. Within minutes, police cars and an ambulance arrived, lights flashing against the pale brick of the building. Officers stepped inside, their expressions hardening as they took in the scene. The brutality of the attack was immediately clear. This was not a robbery gone wrong. This was personal. And somewhere beyond the crowd now gathering outside the police tape, the person who had done this, the person who had been inside that apartment in the early hours of the morning, was walking free. The bedroom where Faith Hedgepeth's body lay quickly became the center of a meticulous, almost surgical investigation. Chapel Hill police sealed off the apartment, pushing back the growing crowd of neighbors, students, and reporters. Yellow crime scene tape stretched across the doorway, fluttering faintly in the humid September air. Inside, detectives moved carefully, eyes scanning for anything out of place. Anything that might explain how a bright, healthy 19-year-old had been reduced to this. The air was heavy with the metallic scent of blood, the room silent except for the click of a camera shutter and the rustle of latex gloves. Faith's injuries told a story, though it was a brutal and incomplete one. Multiple blows to the head from a blunt object, possibly a wine bottle, maybe something heavier. There were also signs of sexual assault, a fact that made the crime feel even more targeted, more personal. Whoever had done this hadn't acted in haste. This was rage, this was domination, and it was intimate. But the strangest piece of evidence wasn't the weapon, which was nowhere to be found, or even the lack of forced entry. It was the message. On a crumpled fast food paper bag, torn open and placed near the body, someone had scrawled in jagged, all-capital letters, "I'm not stupid but jealous." The handwriting was uneven, almost as if the writer's hand had been trembling, or maybe pressing too hard. The ink had bled slightly into the paper's surface. It was a statement dripping with emotion, anger, resentment, and some strange need to declare superiority. But who had written it, and why? Detectives began building the timeline. Surveillance footage from the thrill showed Faith and Karina leaving at 2:06 a.m. They made a brief stop at a late-night restaurant, ordering food and chatting casually with staff. By around 3 a.m., they were back at the apartment. Phone records revealed that Faith was still awake after they got home. She exchanged texts with friends and a male acquaintance into the early morning hours. The last outgoing message from her phone was sent at 3:40 a.m. After that, silence. Karina's account was crucial. She said that sometime after they returned, she left the apartment with a friend named Jordan. She claimed that she and Faith had argued earlier, and she didn't want to sleep there that night. According to her, Faith was alive and in bed when she walked out the door, and the apartment was locked behind her. But when Karina returned at 11 a.m., she didn't come alone. She called a male friend first, asking him to come with her. That detail made detectives pause. Why would she feel the need for backup unless she already suspected something was wrong? Then came the 911 call, a recording that, once public, would become the subject of endless speculation. The female caller's voice was calm, measured, and almost clinical. She described finding her friend unconscious with blood everywhere. When asked if Faith was breathing, she answered quickly, "No," without hesitation or any sign of shock. Investigators noted that from the very beginning of the caller spoke about Faith as if she already knew she was dead. Still, suspicion didn't equal proof. Police interviewed Karina, her friends, Faith's ex-boyfriend, and Karina's on-again, off-again boyfriend, Eric Jones. Jones quickly became a person of interest. He had a volatile history, and Faith had reportedly encouraged Karina to end the relationship. Detectives wondered if this could be the source of the jealousy mentioned in the note. But then came the first major forensic breakthrough, a clean DNA profile left at the crime scene. It was from a male, and it didn't match Eric Jones. In fact, it didn't match anyone in CODIS, the National Criminal DNA Database. That sample became the centerpiece of the case, the one undeniable link between the killer and Faith. But it was also a wall they couldn't break through. Without a match, the DNA was like a key with no lock to fit. Days turned into weeks. Police followed tips, canvassed the neighborhood, and re-interviewed witnesses. Some leads felt promising: a suspicious figure seen near the complex, a rumor about a jealous acquaintance. But each one collapsed under scrutiny. And in the background, the community of Chapel Hill grew restless. Vigils were held on the UNC campus, candles flickering in the warm night as friends and strangers stood together, holding signs that read "Justice for Faith." Her family attended each one, Connie's face a mixture of grief and unshakable determination. For all the activity, the investigation seemed stuck. The note, the DNA, the timeline, none of it was enough to put a name to the killer. And so the case that had once dominated headlines began to fade from the daily news. But for detectives, it never really left their minds. Faith's killer had left behind a message in his DNA. That meant he had made two mistakes. It was just a matter of time before one of them brought him down. The day after Faith's body was found, the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill was in shock. Campus bulletin boards filled with her smiling photographs, images from sorority events, charity fundraisers, basketball games, now surrounded by candles and handwritten notes. Professors paused their lectures to acknowledge the tragedy, and the local police presence around the off-campus apartments intensified. Detectives knew they were walking a tightrope. The public demanded answers. The university wanted reassurance, and Faith's family, hundreds of miles away in Warren County, needed closure. Yet the reality was this: they had almost no clear leads. The crime scene team had collected dozens of potential pieces of evidence: fibers from the bed sheets, fingerprints on the door handle, a fast food takeout bag from the kitchen trash, and of course, the bloody Bacardi bottle found near the bed. But each piece was a puzzle fragment without a picture to guide it. Then there was the note. It was hastily scribbled on a torn fast food bag in thick black marker. "I'm not stupid, Biram. Jealous." The handwriting looked rushed, angry, almost childlike. Detectives photographed it from multiple angles, bagged it carefully, and sent it to the state lab. Was this left by the killer to send a message, or was it meant to frame someone else? Meanwhile, investigators began digging into Faith's digital life. Her phone was recovered from the bedroom floor, cracked but functional. Dozens of text messages from the night before came to light. Many were between her and her best friend, Karina Rosario, the same friend who had spent the early part of the night with her. Karina's initial statement was consistent. She and Faith had gone out to the Thrill nightclub, returned to their apartment around 3 a.m., and then she left with a guy to go to another friend's place, leaving Faith alone. When she returned the next morning, she found Faith's body, but detectives couldn't ignore the undercurrents in their friendship. Friends described occasional jealousy. Faith was popular, charismatic, and had recently been in contact with Karina's on-again, off-again boyfriend, Eric Jones. It wasn't necessarily romantic, but the texts hinted at tension. Adding another layer of intrigue was a voicemail retrieved from Faith's phone. It was time-stamped just after 1 a.m., before she and Karina had returned from the club. The audio was garbled, but you could hear voices, Faith's, another female's, and a male's over loud background music. Some experts later claimed you could detect anger in the exchange, possibly even a threat. Others insisted it was just drunken chatter. By the end of September 2012, weeks had passed and no arrests had been made. The case was gaining media attention, both locally and nationally. Crime shows wanted interviews. True crime blogs dissected every available detail. Internet sleuths pored over social media profiles of everyone connected to Faith. Theories multiplied. Some pointed to Brandon Edwards, Faith's ex-boyfriend, who had a history of controlling behavior. Others focused on Karina's boyfriend, Eric, who had been spotted at the club the night Faith died. Still others suggested an unknown stalker, someone drawn to Faith's magnetic personality and beauty. The pressure mounted on the Chapel Hill Police Department. At a press conference, they announced they were working with the FBI and had submitted DNA from the crime scene to CODIS, the National DNA Database. The statement was meant to reassure the public, but in truth, the lab results brought more frustration. There was DNA, but no match. And so Faith's case began to drift toward the limbo that swallows many unsolved murders. Leads dried up, tips slowed, and the once bright media spotlight dimmed. But one thing kept the investigation alive: the belief among detectives that the killer had been inside Faith's circle. Someone she knew, someone who had been in her apartment that night without forcing entry. What they didn't know, what no one knew, was that the DNA waiting in the evidence freezer would eventually tell the truth. It would just take nearly a decade for that truth to surface. Years passed, but the memory of Faith Hedgepeth's murder never faded in Chapel Hill. Her family still gathered every September 7th to remember her, lighting candles, wearing shirts with her picture, and speaking about her infectious laugh. Yet every anniversary brought the same painful reality. Her killer was still out there. For investigators, this was not a cold case they had given up on. Detective Ben Barber, who had been with the case from early on, often said, "Faith never left my desk." Her file remained open, thick with reports, evidence photos, and lab results. On the wall above his workspace, he kept her smiling graduation photo, reminding him daily why this case mattered. From the start, police had DNA from the crime scene. It was the killer's, clear, uncontaminated, and ready for a match. But years of running it through databases brought nothing. The person responsible had never been arrested for another serious crime, never given law enforcement a sample. The trail felt cold, but technology was about to change everything. By 2021, genetic genealogy, used famously in catching the Golden State Killer, had become more advanced. Investigators decided to try it for Faith's case. They uploaded the suspect's DNA profile into genealogical databases used for crime solving, looking for distant relatives who might share small segments of DNA with the unknown killer. It was like piecing together a family tree with only a few leaves. At first, the results seemed thin, a handful of third and fourth cousins. But as genealogists mapped connections, one branch began to point toward a family from North Carolina. Among them was a man named Miguel Enrique Salguero Olivares. He had lived in the Chapel Hill area in 2012. He wasn't in Faith's immediate circle, but the proximity and time frame were suspicious. Investigators discreetly followed him. One day after he discarded a drink bottle, police retrieved it, sent it to the lab, and waited. When the results came back, they were decisive. A perfect match to the DNA found at the scene of Faith's murder. On September 16, 2021, nearly 9 years after the crime, officers moved in. Salguero Olivares, then 28 years old, was arrested without incident. News cameras caught the moment he was led away in handcuffs, his face unreadable. For Faith's family, the call from police brought a storm of emotions. Her father, Roland, described it as a relief and a heartbreak all at once. Relief that the man who had stolen his daughter's life was finally identified. Heartbreak that nothing could bring her back. Chapel Hill reacted with shock. Many had assumed the killer was someone in Faith's close social circle. Instead, it appeared to be someone on the periphery, a man with no obvious motive that the public could see. Prosecutors began preparing for trial, while journalists dug into Salguero Olivares' past. They found a young man who had arrived in the U.S. from Guatemala as a child, had minor brushes with the law, but nothing that predicted the violence of Faith's murder. His connection to her, how they crossed paths, why he entered her apartment that night remained unclear. For the police, the arrest was validation of years of persistence. "This is why we never give up," Detective Barber told reporters. "Faith deserved justice, and her family deserved answers." Yet even with the suspect in custody, the haunting details of that September night in 2012 still loomed large. The crime scene notes, the autopsy findings, the violent nature of the attack, none of it had lost its power to disturb. And for the people who knew Faith, the arrest wasn't the end of the story. The trial would determine the fate of the accused, but in their hearts, they knew no verdict could undo what had been done. The court proceedings were set to reveal more about what happened in those final hours of Faith's life, and perhaps, at long last, the motive. The courtroom that September morning was brimming with tension. Sunlight filtered through the tall windows of the Durham County Courthouse, yet it did little to dispel the heavy, electric air. Every seat in the gallery was occupied. Family members, reporters, students who had followed the case for years, and community members who had lived with the shadow of this tragedy since 2012. Faith's family sat quietly in the front row, their faces marked with a mix of grief and anticipation. They had waited nearly a decade for this moment, and now the man accused of taking their daughter's life was finally about to face a jury. Miguel Enrique Salguero Olivares was led into the courtroom in shackles, wearing a suit provided by his defense team. His hair was neatly combed, his face expressionless. For years, he had been a ghost in this story, an unknown figure connected only by DNA. But now, here he was, in the flesh. Prosecutors described him as a dangerous man with a history of violence and jealousy. They painted a picture of an unplanned but brutal killing, one that happened in the heat of the moment, after a night of confrontation and rejection. The jury was shown photographs from the crime scene, images so haunting that many turned their heads. The pool of blood, the overturned items in the apartment, and the injuries on Faith's body told a story of extreme violence. The medical examiner testified that Faith had been struck repeatedly on the head, causing catastrophic brain injuries, before being sexually assaulted. The attack, they said, was not quick. It was frenzied, fueled by rage. The prosecution's most powerful weapon was the DNA evidence. A forensic expert explained, in painstaking detail, how the male DNA recovered from the crime scene matched Salguero Olivares with absolute certainty. There was no possibility of coincidence, no alternative explanation that could hold up against the science. They also revealed that his cell phone records placed him near Faith's apartment at the time of her death, despite his earlier claims that he had never been there. The defense fought back, trying to cast doubt on the timeline and the chain of custody of the DNA. They suggested that others, perhaps even people close to Faith, might have been involved, hinting at a wider conspiracy. But these suggestions lacked evidence, and with each passing day of testimony, the case against Salguero Olivares grew stronger. Faith's friends and family gave emotional statements, sharing memories of her laughter, her ambitions, and the kindness she had shown to everyone around her. Her father's voice cracked as he recalled the last time he spoke to her and how he had promised to visit her at UNC before the semester was over. "I never got that chance," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. After weeks of testimony, the jury retired to deliberate. For hours, they pored over the evidence, reviewing photos, transcripts, and forensic reports. Finally, they returned to the courtroom. The foreman rose and, in a voice that was steady but heavy with finality, announced the verdict: guilty of first-degree murder and first-degree sexual assault. There was a sharp intake of breath across the room. Faith's mother closed her eyes, tears streaming down her face. Some of her friends embraced, holding each other tightly, as though afraid to let go. Salguero Olivares showed no visible emotion, staring straight ahead as if the words had not registered. The judge sentenced him to life in prison without the possibility of parole. It was the harshest penalty available in the state of North Carolina for his crimes. Outside the courthouse, the media swarmed around Faith's family. They spoke briefly, thanking the investigators who had never given up, the forensic teams who had pieced together the puzzle, and the community for their unwavering support. "Justice has been served," her mother said, her voice breaking, "but nothing can bring our Faith back." In Chapel Hill, the university held a candlelight vigil in Faith's memory. Students gathered on the quad, holding flickering candles, sharing stories, and singing some of her favorite songs. A gentle wind rustled through the trees as her friends spoke of her warmth, her humor, and her passion for helping others. Even in death, Faith continued to inspire. The case had left deep scars, not only on her family but on the entire community. For years, the murder had been a chilling reminder of how quickly a life could be taken and how darkness could hide in plain sight. But the resolution brought a measure of peace. Faith's loved ones could finally let go of the gnawing uncertainty and focus on keeping her spirit alive through scholarships, advocacy work, and community service in her name. Still, questions lingered. Why had Salguero Olivares acted with such brutality? What had driven him to target Faith? Some answers would never be fully known, lost forever to the night of September 6, 2012. Faith Hedgepeth's life was short, but her legacy was enduring. She was more than a victim. She was a daughter, a friend, a student, and a young woman whose dreams were as bright as her smile. That was the story of Faith Hedgepeth, a young woman full of dreams, whose life was tragically cut short, leaving behind a mystery that haunted everyone for years. How did you find this story? If you liked it, make sure to give it a thumbs up. Share your thoughts in the comments, and don't forget to subscribe for more real and chilling true crime cases.